Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and today I'm speaking with Christine Folch, author of the Book of Yerba Mate, A Stimulating History. Christine, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on our podcast. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Well, I think of myself as somebody who's really lucky because I have turned my interests and obsessions not just into a hobby, but into my job. So I'm a professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University, and I work on the things that really interest me. I feel really, really, really lucky about that. So I work on politics and nature and food in Latin America.
Wow, it's such a fascinating combination.
I think so. I mean, these are my obsessions, right? I could call it my job.
So, what led you to write a book about yerba mate? What interested you in the topic, and why did you decide that you wanted to do an entire book about it?
Yeah. So maybe we can step back and ask not just yerba mate, but like why I write about food and why I write about food from Latin America. So there's there are many kind of different ways into this answer, but I think maybe the best way to start is with a kid's book. So there's a kid's book called Lunch from Home, which I picked up and read a couple months ago while I was with my kid at the public library here. And this story, it's a story based on 6 chefs or 4 chefs who are from minority backgrounds, and they go to school and they go to kindergarten, and people react to their food as if it's weird. And it's a story of my food from home is actually really awesome. And so my kid was sitting there reading, I don't know, about trains and trucks and things like that. And I was having an incredible moment with this book, Lunch from Home, because it happened to me. So I'm the daughter of immigrants. My mother is from Cuba and my father's from the Dominican Republic. And I love the food from these cultures of origin. But when I brought my food from home to school in kindergarten, people were like, that's weird. And I kind of, maybe this is like an underdog kind of story thing. Like I've wanted to show people that the food from Latin America is really interesting and really delicious and really important to think about. And so that was what I was thinking when I was a kid. And now I'm a grown up. And I love writing about food, and I love studying food because food is intensely personal. We have these memories of our grandmother's kitchen, or we have this notion of comfort food, but food is also about massive global processes. And so in just thinking about one meal or one item, we can tell so many different stories. So I wanted to write about yerba mate because yerba mate tells so many stories at the same moment. It's this beverage. It's really popular in South America. And it's got, it's really popular in the Middle East in some communities, and now, in the United States and the North Atlantic world as well. But, by following this one drink, I wanted to kind of see how this one beverage connected these intensely large global processes and these very personal rituals of experience. So that's a little bit about why I wrote the book.
One of the things you describe in the book is how yerba mate is becoming more popular, and yet I'll be honest, it's a beverage I myself have never tried, and it was so reading your book for me was very educational. I was wondering if you could perhaps explain a bit about what exactly is yerba mate, and where exactly does it come from, and in how does it become the beverage that we know it as today?
Yeah. So yerba mate is the world's 3rd most popular stimulating infusion, or stimulating drink, naturally caffeinated stimulating drink. So it's behind tea and coffee. And it comes from a holly tree that grows in the heart of South America. And so what people do is they pick the leaves, they dry them, they smoke them, they roast them a little bit to give them a smoky flavor often. And then, you use it like any kind of any kind of leaf for a tea. You soak it in liquid. In South America, the traditional way of drinking it is to put an incredibly large quantity, so something like half a cup, in some sort of drinking vessel, and then to pour water into it, and then to suck the water out through a straw, a metal straw that is perforated on the bottom, so it filters out the leaves. And that straw is called bombilla. It rhymes with tortilla. And so there's a sort of very iconic image of a gourd, which is the traditional cup that indigenous people have used in South America. And that practice moved from indigenous people to settlers from Europe and beyond. So the gourd cup, which is actually what the word mate itself means. It doesn't actually originally it doesn't refer to the leaf itself, the drink. It refers to the idea of a cup. And so there's this gourd with these leaves and this metal straw, and that's traditionally how you drink it. But you can also drink it in tea bags. And so lots of people are drinking it that way as well. Now, when I was working on this, I learned, I knew I was going to work on a book on yerba mate because as I said before, I'm really lucky. I've been able to turn my obsessions into my job. What I was not expecting when I was doing this research on this drink in South America is that it would actually lead me home. And I mean that for two reasons. One is, because I realized kind of after the fact, after I started getting started on yerba mate, that my first exposure to yerba mate was not with the gourd and the bombilla and that kind of thing, which is when I thought I first saw it. A friend of mine brought it from South America. But my first exposure was actually when I was a kid with my grandparents from Cuba, because Cubans have a soft drink made out of yerba mate called materva. And that's the kind of stuff that we drank when we were little kids. Too much caffeine, too much sugar, but there you go.
It really is. There's so much to it that I was not aware of. One of the things I thought was especially interesting was how you identify there's an element of yerba mate in American culinary history that is not as well known. We talk a lot about tea. Obviously, there's this iconic association with American history. Coffee is an incredibly popular beverage, but as you point out, yerba mate has been there. It's not a new drink to Americans. That it's one that has been as much a part of our history as these other beverages. That it's not just a Latin American beverage, or it's not just a colonial beverage.
That's right. So one of the things that I think is so cool. So this is the other way that yerba mate led me home, which is it led me to learn about another beverage that's basically like mate's cousin. So here in North America, all across the south of this continent, grows another holly, so another evergreen. The leaves are quite different in size from yerba mate, but we have our own local caffeinated beverage that grows all over the North American South. And when I say it grows all over, it's like in my parents' yard. When I used to live on campus, at Duke University, when I was just starting to do the research on this, I was like, wait, there's a North American caffeinated beverage? What? I mean, it ended up being like the shrub that was outside the window of the dormitory at Duke. This thing is everywhere, and it's called Yaupon. Now it's spelled Yaupon, and we want to pronounce it Yao, but that's not how it goes. It goes Yaupon. So it rhymes with mo and toe. So Yaupon is, we have our own caffeinated drink and plant here that grows all over the place. It's super easy to grow. It's really drought resistant. It grows on the North Carolina coast. So if it's sandy and like salty and really windy, this plant loves to grow there. It's kind of like a shrub-sized shrub-sized plant, and it produces a caffeinated beverage that is incredibly similar in flavor and caffeine intensity, and also the other alkaloids that are in yerba mate. Yerba mate doesn't just have caffeine; it has theobromine and theophylline, which are other stimulants that make you feel good. And so this plant that we have here in the United States is also very similar, and it's been in use since time immemorial. We've got clear records of like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of usage, written records of it. And we know through the archaeological records that people have been using this for way longer. So studying yerba mate, thinking, oh, I'm going to study this beverage, and that's really popular in places like Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, that part of the world, brought me to North Carolina to learn about a beverage that is in plain sight and yet hidden. We've forgotten that this was a beverage that people used to drink, and still to this day do in some small communities in North America. And the puzzle of, wait a second, mate is so popular that it's like the subject of the first written tango. It's been commercial agriculture for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's super popular in the Middle East. It's like kind of really trendy. And yet we have something in our backyards, some of us quite literally, that serves the same purpose, and we don't know about it. Why? And so this is what I love about food, right? It raises all these questions about kind of the way we live our daily lives.
You also use mate to describe the evolution of these global networks that have made it so widely available today. And I was wondering if you could perhaps take us through that process of how it goes from being an indigenous Mesoamerican drink to being one that is present in multiple continents across the world, hundreds of years before today.
So maybe the first thing to know about yerba mate is that it's really good. It is a stimulating drink that's got caffeine in it. So just like coffee and tea, maybe the first time you had black tea or the first time you had coffee, your reaction was not like, oh God, thank you, this is exactly what I needed. Although I think that is kind of how we feel. That's how I felt this morning when I was making some coffee. But these are they're a little bit bitter, and so they're sometimes we call them acquired tastes. So one of the questions that is maybe at the heart of the book is, why don't we drink yerba mate in the United States? Why do we drink tea from China? Why, or now it's not just grown in China, but right, why do we drink Camellia sinensis? Why do we drink coffee? And often the answer that people raise is like, rather than the big, huge stimulant drink that's from the Americas. And the answer is, well, people didn't know about it. We're only learning about it now in 2024 when we're buying your book. But that's not the answer, because, coffee came into at least Western European knowledge pretty late. It was like in the 15 and 1600s. And tea came just after that. And so, so Europeans didn't start. I mean, can you imagine poor Europe? It didn't have a caffeine habit until the last 500 years. Yerba mate comes into European kind of experiences really early when the Spanish get to South America. So one of the things we can tell is that it's very clear that when the Spanish come into contact with indigenous communities in South America, indigenous communities have knowledge of their environment and plants, et cetera. And so we know that indigenous people in the region that is called Paraguay and sort of greater Paraguay, so the area around it, so parts of Argentina and Brazil, especially where mate grows, people were using this beverage for its potent purposes. So as maybe a spiritually inflected, important drink, but also a social beverage. And it seems, the Spanish got to the heart of South America sometime in the early 1500s. And they quickly took up the habit. they so quickly took up the habit of drinking yerba mate that they didn't actually ever write about when they took up the habit. So what happens is, so by the middle of the 16th century, so by the middle of the 1500s, the city of Asuncion, which is now the capital of Paraguay, is founded. And by the 1560s, there's already commerce and trade in yerba mate. The Spanish are already sort of selling it and shipping it around. And in the early part of the Spanish Empire in South America, there were all these things happening in Peru, and there were all these things happening in Mexico in terms of, silver and gold and military expeditions to get all of that. But the parts of Latin America where yerba mate grows doesn't have the riches of gold and silver, but it does have this green gold, this amazing plant that is tasty and, let's be honest, addictive. It's got caffeine. Unless, just in the same way that coffee and tea, get us hooked. And the Spanish quickly used mate as money. And so it became the currency of the realm, and shipments of mate went all over South America on the backs of mules and in boats. And so in the first couple hundred years of the Spanish Empire in South America, there was a really vigorous trade in yerba mate. It went from Paraguay down to Buenos Aires. It went across the Andes Mountains into Chile. It went up on the eastern side of the Andes Mountains into Bolivia, and then into Peru, into Lima. And so there was a massive amount of trade, but it was really focused within the Spanish Empire. So what happens in places like France and Britain are that they're not getting sort of the circulation of goods that happen inside South America, because it's kind of closed off within the Spanish Empire. And so the British and the French take up different stimulant habits as coffee moves westward across Europe in the form of the coffee house, and as tea kind of just follows its footprint. So I just told you a story of like these deep colonial histories, just to say that the things that are on our plates today have these deep pasts, and they don't get here by accident. Mate has multiple lives or multiple reincarnations, and now it's not this colonial commodity inside the Spanish Empire. Now it's a fully capitalist commodity that is, produced, grown, and shipped in many, many, many places in the world. But that's where it got its start.
It's that you highlight something that for me I think is one of the key differences between mate and some of the other products, because when I was reading your book, I was thinking about two other examples of agricultural commodities that became part of the global diet. I'm thinking of potatoes and chocolate, both which were also contributions from Latin America, but which were ones that had a far greater reach. You highlight how where mate is competing with tea and coffee, which are simultaneously, or maybe just a little bit ahead of mate in terms of becoming part of the diet in all these different places.
So yeah, no, and we're so thankful for the contribution of potatoes and chocolate, and of course vanilla and chocolate come from the same place. And so what would the world be without Mexico? It would be a much sadder place.
Much saltier.
Oh yeah, totally. So so this raises a really good question. So why does the potato cross over as opposed to mate, and why does chocolate cross over as opposed to mate? And I think there are lots of really good answers, but I think one of the simplest is that potatoes are really easy to grow. And so, you can grow them in Peru, you can try to grow them in North Carolina, you can grow them in Ireland, you can grow them almost anywhere in the world. So they're very good at transplanting, and you obviously store potatoes as potatoes and put them in boats and take them somewhere else and stick them in the ground and they can grow. Chocolate, is a plant that was planted in the circum-Caribbean, and in, warm parts of Peru, et cetera. So chocolate has this sort of expanse, this pre-colonial expanse that's not just inside one empire. Yerba mate is very difficult to cultivate. It only grows in one place in the world. And so it's got these very specific growing requirements. So that means it's harder to grow than coffee and tea. And so it needs to be in a place that is generally quite warm. So it has to be tropics, but it has to be able to get below freezing like one night a year or 2 nights a year. So it has these really, really precise growing requirements, which are hard to find elsewhere. So that's one thing. And the other thing is it proved quite challenging to germinate it. So one of the things that I think is super cool about yerba mate is it's a story of lost and found knowledge. And one of the bits of lost and then found and then lost again kind of knowledge is how to germinate and cultivate yerba mate. So when mate becomes this really important commodity in the early Spanish Empire, the people who end up figuring out, so what happens is the Spanish have enslaved indigenous people in an economic system called encomienda, which is it's like bonded labor. For the benefit of their evangelization. But so what the Spanish would do is they would take communities of indigenous people and they would take the men and take them deep into the forests, the natural forests where yerba mate grew. And these people would be gone for like 4 months, harvesting yerba mate deep in the woods and bringing it back to urban centers. And then it would be, commercialized. And the other so this is devastating to populations because you're moving people around. Into the midst of this, because Paraguay did not have the mineral wealth of Peru or Mexico, Spain kind of didn't care about it as much. And so when the Jesuit order made a request to start establishing missions in Paraguay, the Spanish crown was like, sure, that's fine. We don't really care. And so the Jesuits established, so this is sort of the Jesuit mission story of South America. And if you've seen, the movie The Mission with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro in all the glory of what they looked like in the early 1980s. This is that story. And so if people haven't seen that movie, highly recommended, even just for the visuals. So the Jesuits established these utopian communities, which have their strengths and their weaknesses, on the top of hills in what is yerba mate territory. And the Jesuits and the indigenous community that they're working with, and particularly in Paraguay, Eastern Paraguay, in yerba mate territory is the Guarani. The Jesuits and the Guarani figure out how to grow yerba mate. And so around the Jesuit missions, they established massive orchards of mate in the 1600s. And so they had this very controlled cultivation of this plant, of this tree, and they processed it in the missions, and they stored it in the missions, and they aged it in the missions, and then they shipped it and they sold it. And the reason they sold it was because there were things so the idea of the missions is that they would be sort of self-sufficient, but there's some things that could not be made inside the missions. And so they needed to have some coinage. And so they would sell mate for that. And so Jesuit mate had a reputation as the best yerba mate in the Spanish Empire or in the Spanish sort of colonial orbit. And this made the colonists super jealous because the Jesuits sold a much pricier product than the sort of wild harvested mate. Jesuits were expelled from the Spanish Empire, Spanish holdings, in the 1760s. And when they leave, the knowledge of how to cultivate yerba mate vanishes. And so there's this found and then lost.
So what you have then is, and this takes to the next part of your book where you talk about sort of the rediscovery of mate. and how and how it's intertwined with simultaneously this growing scientific exploration of mate, and how that those become kind of part of this overall process of how in effect we are updating our knowledge of mate to what we understand to be today.
Yeah. So what happens when the Jesuits leave is their knowledge goes away with them. That's how the story has gotten told. The Jesuits left and they took their secret with them and nobody knows, except that they wrote it in books. So if you read Jesuit like journals, they're all like, here's what we do. And it's all in there. Right. So they wrote it down. And the other people who obviously knew how to cultivate yerba mate were like the indigenous people, Guarani, who lived in the missions. They knew. No, apparently, no one ever asked them, how do you do this thing? But when the Jesuits leave, the sort of missions go into disrepair. And yet places like Argentina and Uruguay, not just Paraguay, where mate grows naturally, but these other centers, get hooked on this drink, and they drink it and they drink it and they drink it as a source of national pride and as a source of a nice little buzz in the morning to wake them up. And so you have a growing demand for it, but you have challenged supply because it's no longer being cultivated, and so it has to be wild foraged, and these very large transnational companies step in to create these sort of large workforces that will forage this mate and sell it to a growing River Plate, Rio Platense public, all the while kind of lamenting the loss of this Jesuit knowledge. And of course, like a bunch of scientists have been, spent the 19th century. The 19th century is a century of science, right? And tried to figure out what they could possibly do to figure out how to recultivate yerba mate. And there were all these kind of scientific ventures to try to do it. And they basically failed for a number of reasons. One of which was, one of the chief characters who was trying to figure out how to cultivate yerba mate is a Frenchman named Bonpland, who is, was a favorite of Napoleon and Josephine, but he ended up getting kidnapped by Paraguay's dictator because the Paraguayan dictator didn't want him to figure out yerba mate, and there's all these stories like this. But what happens is that in the end of the 19th century, kind of desperation does what science can't, and desperation leads a series of immigrants to South America to figure out how to grow mate. This is a story that I unravel in the book, which I think is really worth learning more about. So it's in the book, but there's it raises all these questions about Paraguay and South America in general. So one of the things to know about Paraguay, which is of course where yerba mate or Ilex paraguayensis is from, is that Paraguay suffered a war with its neighbors from 1864 to 1870. And this is the War of the Triple Alliance, where Paraguay fought against the combined forces of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Paraguay is this landlocked country. It was much larger before the war than after because it lost territory in the war. And this war was absolutely devastating. So 9 out of 10 males lost their lives. Not 9 out of 10 men, males, so children. My husband is Paraguayan, and his tatarabuelo, so his great grandfather, was a child soldier in the war and survived a very famous battle. So it's an incredibly devastating story. And what happens as a result of this war is that you have a lot of unpopulated land because so many people died. And so Paraguay welcomed immigrants from Europe to come and recolonize the land. And one of the colonies was a German colony led by Nietzsche's sister and her husband. And these Nietzsche's sister and her husband were fierce anti-Semites. So this is a Nazi German Aryan utopia that they tried to set up in Paraguay. the Aryan experiment failed miserably in many ways, and Nietzsche's sister returned to Europe, sort of kind of in failure, but the Germans who were left there had to figure out how to live in this land that they had been promised would be a paradise and was instead quite challenging. And so one of the guys kind of looking around. So what the people ended up doing is they ended up intermarrying with Paraguayans. So they left the sort of Aryan racial philosophy, and one guy basically was like, I got to figure something out. And so he figured out how to, his last name is Neumann, Friedrich Neumann, figured out how to germinate yerba mate in the 1890s. And he restarted this industry and kind of brought it into, modern economic sort of philosophies, so that, smallholders could have their own yerba mate plots and make their own really high quality product and sell it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all connected. This is what I love about food, is that it connects the entire world. So all of a sudden we've been talking about Nietzsche. We should talk about Wagner, and we should talk about the history of plants and Napoleon and germination, and all of that is connected to this one beverage.
Mm-hmm. Well, we appreciate the time you've taken out of your schedule to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
We just finished launching a documentary in northern Paraguay about, we took testimony from some indigenous elders in northern Paraguay from the Ayureo community. And the film is called Voces del Chaco, Voices of the Chaco. We'll be making it publicly available sometime soon. But we first wanted to launch it in their community because it's a story of their elders. So that's what I've just been coming back from doing.
Wow, it sounds like you're definitely a master of a lot of media there.
So yeah, it was a great experience.
Well, Christine, thank you very much for taking some time out of your schedule to speak with us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Mark. Take care.